I'm John Chowney with Campbellsville University, back once again for another segment of Dialogue on Public Issues. Today I'm interviewing a gentleman and friend from Lexington who's been a guest before on a couple of prior occasions, Dr. Gerald Smith, preeminent historian at the University of Kentucky and a Lexington area pastor. Dr. Smith, welcome back.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a native of Lexington, Kentucky. Was born there, finished high school in Lexington, attended the University of Kentucky, and all 3 degrees. I'm an only child. I'm married to Teresa Smith. It'll be 33 years this year.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we're blessed to be the parents of 2 daughters. One's an elementary school teacher. The other one is a second-year medical student. And so I've been pastoring Pilgrim Baptist Church in Lexington since December 2011.
Okay.
I've been at the University of Kentucky. I'm now a full professor at UK. I've been at the university since 1993.
Okay. Tell us about your work at the university in the history department, obviously.
Yeah, I've had just a wonderful career at the university. Came back in 1993. Was appointed a director of African American Studies in 1997. Served in that role for 8 years. I teach a number of courses on race and sports in America, the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., Kentucky African American history, Kentucky history, and I've taught graduate courses on race relations and on the intellectual history of African Americans and on the civil rights movement.
The particular courses that are your favorites to teach?
Actually, my favorite course right now is Race and Sports in America.
Okay.
And I just developed another course on the history of sports in America, an online course, History of Sports in America. But I also enjoy teaching Kentucky African American history and, of course, the King course. So I sort of rotate really around those 3, Kentucky African American, King, and Race and Sports.
What is it about the sports course that is of interest or that's so challenging for you in terms of teaching?
It gives us a wonderful opportunity to get a window into American history through sports, particularly the role of the African American athlete and how, looking at sports and how it connects with politics and obviously education and even scientific racism and culture. There's just so much that you can put into the pot when you look at sports.
So many people in our culture today, even in elementary and high school, look at the study of history and just kind of roll their eyes and question the relevance of it. What attracted you to the study of history, and what would you say to those in the audience why it's important for us?
Yeah, I was, for me, I'd always been a curious child. My mother worked in a funeral home as a secretary. So she kept me there during the day, and I was just fascinated with death and how people had lived their lives, and I was just curious about the person. So, I was drawn into history because of my curiosity about people and how they lived their lives, and even more importantly, how they died and the legacy they left behind. And so with that, I began interest in individuals, beginning with Daniel Boone and Abraham Lincoln in Kentucky. I was just obsessed with Daniel Boone. And so anytime I had an opportunity to visit a site where Boone had visited in Kentucky, that sort of drew me to history. But once I found out that there was so much opportunity to write and research about the African American experience and also play a role in preserving that experience, that's why I decided to cast my lot as being a history professor. I think it's important because, even today, people are constantly talking about history. How will history record this particular moment in time? Or will an individual be convicted, or will they be vindicated? Because as I remember reading somewhere, and I thought this was very, very profound, somebody wrote that historians are the custodians of the human experience. And so, with that thought in mind, that we really, we collect it, we interpret it, and we present it to the public. And that narrative may remain the same, but how that narrative is interpreted or revised is basically in our hands.
Do Does history repeat itself? Are there cycles of history in a sense that are repetitive?
In some cases, I think history does repeat itself. It's like, okay, we've seen this before, and we know what the Bible says, and this too shall pass.
Mm-hmm.
So, we see our strengths and our weaknesses as we look at history. But also, history obviously gives us an opportunity to avoid some of the mistakes of the past. And, while we're avoiding the mistakes of the past, but at the same time, appreciate those who have tried to steer us in the right direction.
Now, you are a pastor, Pilgrim Baptist Church, Missionary Baptist Church in Lexington. Tell us about your call to ministry and how your call to ministry and your role as an educator, how those intersect and how they're related and how you manage. Like myself, you've done kind of a dual calling, if you will.
Yeah, for me, my calling to the ministry actually goes back to when I was a teenager. I knew something was happening in my life, and I didn't want to be a preacher. And the older I got, the less I wanted to be a minister. And then, of course, after I got my doctorate, I'm in my career now, and but the Lord's hand was on me. I ran, as they say, as hard as I could run. I fought as hard as I could fight. I had to accept the fact that was my calling. My concern,
that's a losing battle, isn't it?
It's a losing battle. I don't know who I thought I was. But I actually became very angry with God because I felt as though God was really destroying my career. And that's not something I wanted to do. But actually God was preparing me on a number of fronts. And one, I was able to see how God merged my profession with my calling, and that was in working with the Martin Luther King Papers Project. Not long after I announced my call to preach, I was a licensed minister, and I was on a telephone call with the director of the King Papers Project, and who invited me to come on board and be a co-editor of the never before published sermons of Martin Luther King.
Wow.
And so, right then God was showing me that, no, be obedient to me, and I'm going to make this work for you. But you got to trust me. And so with that, serving as an editor of the never before published sermons of Martin Luther King, and at the same time being a historian and being a pastor and bringing those two disciplines together, was encouraging for me, and basically was a part of my affirmation of my calling. And then from that, I knew that God had greater plans for me. I wasn't searching for a church. I wasn't on the market, as they say. I didn't apply anywhere. But then I was called to Farristown Baptist Church in Berea in 2003 and served Farristown up to 2011, and then was called to Pilgrim Baptist Church. And so, as you stated, just how do you manage it all?
Right.
As we know, Sundays come quick. You can't preach the same sermon all month long, And, the part of the sermon preparation, the prayer, the visitations, administratively, things that are taking place, all kind of various issues in a good way. And just being with people in the most intimate times of their life.
Right.
Whether it's death or the birth of a child or marriage or some sort of crises or some sort of celebration, it's a blessing to be a part of that. And so what I've seen is that truly God's grace is sufficient.
Yes.
And his strength is made perfect in our weakness, because, when I am weak, he is strong.
Amen.
And that God has shown me that, just when you think you cannot do any more, I'll stretch you wider and show you how strong I am. And so I've learned to trust God through those times. But as you know, it's also important, especially when you have these dual responsibilities, to remain close to God in terms of nurturing and feeding your own soul, in terms of setting aside that time for prayer and for study every day, and getting off alone with God. Because if you don't do that, then you'll get frustrated, you'll get burnout, you want to quit. But in the process, it's allowed me to minister to other folks, to let my light shine, whether it's students, whether it's, other faculty, who see me, not simply as a role as a professor, but
Right.
more importantly as someone who is called of God.
You and I and others in our similar roles, whether in academia or other dual roles, for lack of a better term, at this point, we've had that opportunity to pastor, if you will, outside the church.
Yes.
The four walls of the church and outside the church family to which we're called.
Right.
That's an extraordinary opportunity. And I think a special calling
Yes.
that God has given to us.
Yes.
Serious responsibility.
Right, and I don't take it for granted. I know that I clearly must walk the walk and talk the talk.
Yes.
And how I conduct myself, with integrity and sincerity, and that has a way of catching fire, if you will, and drawing people to me and seeking out my wisdom and my knowledge, but at the same time keeping me humble as well.
Sure.
Knowing just how much I need God every day.
This, as we do this interview, we're in the mid part of Black History Month, the annual celebration and observance of the contributions of Black Americans, Black Kentuckians. Do you think that perhaps God put you in a position in terms of your history degrees and study of history and expertise in history, then calling you to the church, and then opening the doors for you to help interpret and write about Dr. King's papers, given Dr. King being a minister? Did that all come together, do you think, from God's plan?
Oh yeah, without a question. I'd often been asked, Gerald, how did you get that opportunity? How did you get access to the never before published sermons of Martin Luther King that were in Mrs. King's basement? And it had to have been the Lord. Very, very clearly. In 2000, I was inducted into the Martin Luther King Collegium of Scholars at Morehouse College.
Yes.
And it was on Millennium Sunday. I was invited to give words as to why the "I Have a Dream" speech was the greatest speech of the 20th century. So I'm a historian, right? But I'm also a minister. And how that opportunity came into existence couldn't have been nothing but God. Very quickly, I'll share you. I invited a professor from North Carolina to speak at UK because I was director of African American Studies. On the way back to the airport, we were just having a conversation in the car. I was telling him what I was doing. He said these words. He said, "You need to meet a friend of mine who's the dean of chapel, Dr. Lawrence Carter at Morehouse College." I didn't think anything of it. He gets on a plane, leaves. I get a call from Dean Carter, who's the dean of chapel at King International Chapel at Morehouse. Dean Carter says, "Listen, I want you to come to Morehouse in March of 2000, and I want you to give remarks on why the I Have a Dream speech is the greatest speech of the 20th century. We're dedicating that speech on the wall. Not only that, we're going to induct you in the King Collegium of Scholars." I said, "Hold on, wait a minute, sir. I've never met you. I don't know." He said, No, you don't understand." He said, "I got your name from Michael. Michael was the professor I was talking to." He said, "You've heard of the Archangel Michael." He said, "I believe that it is in my spirit to ask you to be the one." Sent chills down my body. I'm like, whoa, So it just, again, sort of, affirmed in my spirit how God has a way of, making plans for you, and you just trust Him, and doors open up you never imagined.
Right. The church was the genesis of the civil rights movement in the South, as well as nationwide. How did God work through the church in the South? And specifically, Dr. King, as I read and have been told, was kind of a reluctant prophet, kind of a reluctant warrior, if you will, for civil rights. Share with us about that.
Yeah, he, of course, King grew up in the church. I mean, his father and grandfather, so, very influential in his life, attended Morehouse. Again, he's, part of the church. I mean,
he was sort of a part of the black elite.
Exactly.
And
that was part of that experience. But, there was Benjamin Mays who was there, was the president of Morehouse College, who had chapel every Tuesday and influencing and shaping the minds of these young men. But King was also very critical of the church, even very critical of his father as well, in terms of his fundamentalist beliefs. That's why he goes on to Crozier Theological Seminary, because it's more liberal in his thinking. But after looking at all of the liberal thinking, reading about the liberal thinking that he was getting out of Crozier, he found himself asking the question, but still, what are we going to do with Jesus? And so he comes back to that, but he realizes that, the church has this very important role in terms of redeeming the soul of America. And because of that, he was critical not only of the church, the believers, but even also pastors and preachers who he believed that found themselves in many cases being taillights rather than being headlights, more concerned about the wheelbase of their car, of their tire, than the concerns of their own parishioners. And he thought the church should do more, that the church should be more outspoken, out front on social justice issues, and was constantly challenging the church on that. He had no problems getting in front of a group of ministers and basically chastising them for not being.
There was a
more
major
outspoken.
schism within the National Baptist Convention, in part over the civil rights movement, and Dr. King was among those that left the National Baptist Convention.
Right, to form the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Big fight broke out and all
Right,
of that.
right.
But that's just how committed he was, to this particular cause. And reminding everyone, not only unbelievers, but believers, and this nation, just what our mistakes were and what we needed to do.
Now, among the many publications you've worked on, you were the co-editor of what's been described as the award-winning Kentucky African American Encyclopedia. You worked on it for several years.
Yes.
I think maybe our paths first crossed during your time working on that. Tell us about that publication, how long it took you and your colleagues to finish that, and the purpose of that particular, what some would say is a historic publication here in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, it was a 9-year process. And quite a bit of support. And again, I want to thank Campbellsville University for being at the forefront of that early support of this volume. It was published in 2015. Myself, along with John Harden and Karen McDaniel, are the general co-editors. It consists of about 1,155 encyclopedia entries of people, places, events, organizations, institutions. 624 pages, 142 photographs, covers 85 of the 120 counties, had 86 sponsors to it, and a number of about 152 authors that contributed to the encyclopedia. So, won a number of awards. One of them was the Thomas D. Clark Medallion Award, and very honored to have that. But what we try to do is to go beyond and outside the traditional narrative of Kentucky history, to sort of capture some of those forgotten and hidden figures in the state's history, all the way from slavery up through the present.
And copies of that are still available. I recently purchased a couple of those, or actually 4 copies, for Greater Campbellsville United to give as gifts for some activities that Wanda Washington was planning here in the community, and they're still available at least via Amazon.
Yes.
So, and I have a copy personally autographed by you in my library at home that I treasure a great deal. A couple of examples of interesting individuals that you learned about during that process that come to mind.
Yeah, there are a number of individuals. I think about St. Elmo Brady, who was the first African American to receive a PhD in chemistry in 1916, was from Kentucky. Alice Dunnigan. In fact, I just finished an over 1,000-word essay on Alice Dunnigan. She was an African American journalist and civil rights activist, was born down in Russellville, Kentucky, was a school teacher initially, but in 1946 was the first African American woman to receive press passes to both houses of Congress. 1948, she was the first African American White House correspondent. In 1948, she's from Kentucky and accompanied Harry Truman on his campaign trail in 1948. There were a number of others. Of course, you got the Muhammad Ali's and the Lyman T. Johnsons who integrated the University of Kentucky. Ali, of course, the great boxing champion. The list goes on and on
Sure.
in terms of individuals and not only individuals, but whether it's looking at baseball, whether it's looking at little perhaps trivial things like in Kentucky, Louisville was the first place to have the first black Boy Scout troop in 1916 in Louisville, Kentucky.
Interesting. You've also been working on a new general history of African American in Kentucky. How's that coming along?
Slow. Because actually what I've done is I have also been working on an anthology of readings that I wanted to put together. So I've almost completed an essay I've titled Revisiting My Old Kentucky Home. And I look at the site and look at the song itself and what that's meant within the context of the civil rights movement in Kentucky. And I finished another article, I'm still just about finished with it. I've just a little bit more research on the African-American athlete and the black campus movement in Kentucky, particularly at the University of Kentucky. And I want to integrate these as a part of this anthology, but still thinking and writing about the general history, the way I wanted to shape it. But busy with everything else, just haven't had that time to really crank it out like I want to.
Sure.
Hopefully within the next year and a half, I'll have it. I mean, I've got everything outlined and a lot of the research has already been done. In
2019, Dr. Smith, why is it important, in your opinion, that we still have this emphasis of Black History Month?
Well, I think given some of the current events that we have seen, the major headlines, whether we're addressing issues of police brutality, whether we're addressing the issues of protest of the NFL players, whether we're looking at the whole controversy surrounding blackface and what that means. We're dealing with these issues now because we've never really put the kind of emphasis on African American history that we should have. I mean, if more people had been exposed to the African American experience, then we would be more aware of that experience. But not only that, we would avoid some of the pitfalls that we're encountering now. And I didn't know it wasn't right to wear blackface. Well, if you've been in an African American history class to learn something about African American history, then you would have been exposed to that.
Do you think that in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, that perhaps the nation felt like racism was a thing of the past, and that we vested expectations both in the black community as well as the majority community in that presidency, that everything was overcome?
Yeah.
Plus, coupled with that precipitated a hidden racism, precipitated the rise of more overt racism that had been kind of tucked down or at least hidden away?
Yeah, well, not for African Americans. I think, for white America, it was a pat on the back. It's like, okay, we have finally overcome.
We talked about post-racism, or
right.
phrases like that. We were in a post-race society, and
we're now living at a time where we are witnesses to Dr. King's final words in that speech. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. And so with the election of President Barack Obama, it's like, oh, we've reached the promised land. But for African Americans, it was simply, gave us greater hope. I think, the Irish poet Seamus Heaney put it best when he said, history says don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the long tidal wave of justice can rise up and history and hope rhyme. And so with that election of Barack Obama, it was sort of like history and hope rhyming for that one moment. And so it's like, okay, maybe things are finally beginning to change. But soon after, once he was elected, you were reminded, like, no, we still have a long way to go. And some of that is because we don't know this nation's history.
Okay. If Dr. Martin Luther King were alive in 2019, what do you think he would have to say to the culture as a whole, to America as a whole?
I think he would. I think he would say something that he had said even before he got into the national spotlight. In in 1954, King preached a sermon, and he preached it, a number of variations of it titled Rediscovering Lost Values. Okay, and sometimes he preached Rediscovering Precious Values. And it was a story of Jesus and his parents going to Jerusalem, and of course they left Jesus in Jerusalem, and then they had to go back and get him. They'd gone a day's journey and had to go back to get him. And so in that sermon, King said some things that I think he would say today, and that is the fact that, you know, we've got to go back and rediscover our moral values. That, and these are his words, the means by which we live have outdistanced the spiritual ends for which we live. That with our scientific genius, we've made the world a neighborhood, but we haven't made it a brotherhood. And so those moral values that we have forgotten, you know, are justice and love and honesty.
Are you optimistic? Obviously, as a Christian and a pastor, we're people of hope and eternal hope. But in the context of our culture and our nation, are you hopeful?
Oh yeah, yeah. You know, always. You know, I believe that that our God can do anything, and you know, I believe that a lot of that responsibility lies with us. You know, that we must manifest that hope in how we live. You know, the problem is that, you know, we as Christians have strayed so far from God, and you know, I know that's a long topic.
That we could do a whole interview on that, don't you think? Any other comments you might have in closing of encouragement to our audience?
Yeah, I would. You know, I think it's important for all of us to look into the mirror, or better yet, look within ourselves, and think about what it means to be a Christian. You know, what does that really mean, and you know, how are our values reflecting that in today's society? You know, we say we're a Christian, but are we really following Christ and how we think and how we vote and how we look at other people? You know, the Bible teaches us that we ought to love you one another.
Amen. Dr. Gerald Smith, historian, pastor, and friend, we thank you for being here, and go in peace and Godspeed along the way.
Thank you, my brother.
This is John Chowning with Dr. Gerald Smith for Dialogue on Public Issues, and we appreciate our loyal audience, both by television and radio. Thank you.